Good evening and welcome everyone to the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute Facebook live event on understanding epidemics. My name is Oren Harman. Charles Rosenberg of Harvard University is one of the leading historians of medicine in the world. Some would say one of the finest practitioners of social history of his generation. Among many books, he is author of The Cholera Years, which came out in 1962 and became a classic. No Other Gods on Science and American Social Thought, The Rise of America's Hospital System, and Explaining Epidemics. Rosenberg is a recipient of the William H. Welch Medal of the American Association of the History of Medicine and the George Sarton Medal for Lifetime Achievement from the History of Science Society. He is a council member of the American Philosophical Society, the Institute of Medicine, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and has twice been awarded Guggenheim Fellowships. In other words, besides being an amazingly kind and also funny human being, we're dealing here with an intellectual heavyweight. And I want to thank you, Charles, for taking the time to speak to me and to our listeners this evening from across the Atlantic in Cambridge, Mass. Are you doing well over there?
Well, I think as is the case in Jerusalem, we're socially distanced. So my wife and I have, aside from walking the dog, it's been now 3 or 4 weeks, and we're compliant. We're law-abiding. When we go out, we wear a mask. I'm not sure how significant that is, but I think it's the right thing to do. And it's a very odd situation for someone who started in life as an accidental student of pandemics to live through one and to not know what the outcome is. There's no structure to it. So it's...
no structure to the pandemic, but there'll be a little bit of structure to our discussion. So the way we're going to run it is that Charles and I will start a conversation that will hopefully span both the history of a number of epidemics, the theory behind the social construction of disease, what's called the social construction of disease, and then thoughts about our own current moment, what Charles calls tsuris. And all the while, I'd like to encourage listeners to send in questions and comments, which I hope to be able to incorporate as we go along. So why don't we start off on a personal note? What got you interested in the history of medicine?
Well, as in many aspects of life, it was an accident, really. I was an undergraduate pre-med, and I kind of hated the big, pre-med courses. And by accident, my roommate and I found a little course in the medical school. This was at the University of Wisconsin, called The History and Geography of Disease. And we didn't know what that was, but we thought it would be small, which seemed to be our major criteria. And at that point, the medical school credits, you could use as an undergraduate with the permission of the professor. So we signed up, and the professor was very charismatic. He was a European, he was very political. He'd been trained both in medicine and anthropology. He left Germany the day Hitler was made chancellor. I didn't foreground this or know it at the time, but he was head of the young Trotskyite movement in Germany. Then he lived with Trotsky for a while in Turkey. This added a kind of romantic glow, for my adolescent self when I've discovered all this. But he was a very, very thoughtful and, as I said, charismatic teacher who had a social orientation, a left orientation, but in terms of understanding the causes and frameworks to think about disease, his left politics made him think about issues that were not just strictly laboratory, technical, internal to medicine. And he also, which I think I just was lucky, that he had training in anthropology, so that he was oriented toward the doctor-patient relationship and to the cultural ideas that structured that doctor-patient relationship, which were time and place specific. And I mean, I only in retrospect did I see how lucky I was. He was also interested in ecological questions. And he wrote a very prescient book on malaria in the mid-40s, and which argued for, I would call it an ecological, he didn't use the word ecological, which sounds very trendy and modern, but that's what it was. So if you think about malaria, you have to think about economic history, you have to think about climate, you have to think about cultural issues as well as mosquitoes, and et cetera. So I think I lucked into a situation where all those things got configured somehow, and I quit. I got bored with organic chemistry and quantitative analysis, and I went to graduate school in history thinking I would study the American Revolution. But I got seduced into cholera, which I bumped up against as an undergraduate, and I did a term paper for a course. And the rest, you might say, is history.
So before we go any further into cholera, could you just give us your most simple, kind of straightforward explanation of the social construction of disease? What does the social construction of disease mean?
Well, it's a slogan. It's a reference point. To me, it means that people who study medicine should be historians, should contextualize, should try to see the world and the choices that people make in terms similar to those of the participants, so to speak. And what attracted me about cholera was that it was a way of thinking or getting at how people thought about immigrants, about religion, about municipal responsibilities for things like cleaning up the streets and providing water. And so I wasn't trained as a doctor, and I didn't have that narrative of, medicine is how we got to where we are now, so that discovery and, Pasteur and Koch were where you were going to get to by looking at cholera and discussions about infectious disease. I got interested, and I was also interested in the history of religion for reasons I can't really explain, because I was a totally secular person, but I was fascinated by history of religion, which I saw as a piece of social and intellectual history. So, and then cholera by accident really configured those things, because, and this is I like to call it a sampling device, which is a cliche too, but it's also a stress test. In other words, cholera wasn't there all the time, but when it did come, everyone had to respond to it. A lot more people died of tuberculosis than died from cholera in the 19th century. But tuberculosis was background noise, and cholera was a signal, as a signal versus noise. Just as people didn't write that much, except for some reformers, about babies who died from summer diarrhea. Babies died from summer diarrhea, just as the way people died from TB. But cholera was a challenge, and it elicited responses, controversy, self-conscious and not so self-conscious ways of constructing the world to make sense out of cholera. anyway, that's what's, was the slippery slope that got me into what you call the social construction, but in some ways, I would call it ethno-historical perspective on medicine, past medicine.
So, but to our ears, that seems, I don't want to say trivial, because it's not trivial in any sense, but it seems rather uncontroversial. So why was this idea so novel when it was first kind of introduced with books like the Cholera Years?
Well, I think because medical history, like legal history, for example, was dominated by practitioners and by their priorities and values. And it was mostly an amateur activity by doctors. Some of them were very smart and very learned, but they didn't, to them, a lot of these ideas were, again, background noise. What they were interested in is how we got progress was made. How did we get to where we are? Or if they were writing from the history, for example, of surgery, they were interested in how antiseptic surgery or certain technical procedures and technical advances got made, because that was important to them. And, the fact that people, let's say, were bleeding patients up until the mid-19th century, that was just sort of, I wouldn't say an embarrassment, but quaint.
Right.
I mean, but to me, it was, the texture of life and needed explaining, how doctors and patients thought about what they were doing, even if in retrospect we say, well, that wasn't rational,
Right. So let's dwell a little bit on cholera in America in the 19th century. And I think it's interesting, in particular from our perspective today, because, as you said, compared to malaria and tuberculosis, it actually claimed relatively few American lives, but it was novel and therefore terrifying. And it demanded a response in virtually every area of life and thought, which is something that I think that we can sort of understand today with what's happening with COVID-19. So when you approached the epidemics in 1832 and 1848, and then again 1866, what were you actually trying to do? And what do you think you were able to show?
Well, that's a good question. And I feel it's almost easier to explain, as you implied, because people are now living through a parallel, not identical, but parallel set of circumstances. What I tried to do, and this I was lucky because they were more or less the same interval between these three epidemics. So you could compare and contrast. And what I found was, to make a complicated story simple but not distort what I think I found, was an increasing secularization of society. The primary orientation in 1832 for most people was religious. What is the moral meaning, put it that way? The transcendent meaning. Why now? Why us? What should that make us think about? And I read 30 or 40 religious newspapers that were, representing different sects, different points of view, different theological orientations. But I think by 1866, it's not that people weren't giving sermons about the disease, but it was much, I wouldn't say an afterthought, but the primary debate, the primary considerations were much more, we would now call them policy oriented. How do you get pure water? How do you clean the streets? What are we going to do about tenement conditions? And that was right after the Civil War, when there had been a lot of concern about crowding, about infectious disease, and about the beginnings of nursing, hospitals, and some of the organizational questions that we associate with modern medicine. So maybe
cholera in 1832, most people thought it was because you were sinful.
Sinful, imprudent, or Irish. In other words, this blaming victims always works, right? Or stigmatizing victims. And because a lot of the early cases and the most dramatic levels of death were in working class areas, where the longshoremen lived, where the construction workers lived. And in the American cities, a lot of those people were Irish or other recent immigrants, but the Irish were the most conspicuous. And they had the misfortune to be Catholic as well as Irish. So that, it's not that they weren't racist, and they were also didn't think much about African Americans, but the social tensions and the social hostilities were focused a lot on this, ethnocentrism, you might say, but it was also religious as well. So that was very conspicuous. And, the human tendency to find a reason why certain people, a reason that excludes you. Yeah, you weren't Irish, you went to church, you didn't drink too much, there's a parallel, obviously, for example, with AIDS, where AIDS got defined as, a gay plague, because it was easy to blame people that you felt uncomfortable with and that you wanted to stigmatize. So in a way, the oversimplified bottom line is there is this human tendency when you're threatened to want to make sense out of it by defining the target population, if you want to call it that, in ways that stigmatize them and that make you feel a little more secure. If you were a white Protestant middle-class person in New York in 1832, or if you were a straight middle-class person in New York in 1982,
right.
The situation.
So going back to the 19th century, so disease is sinful in 1832, or down to you being an other. And then in 1866, it becomes a kind of consequence of remedial faults in sanitation in such a time.
I make that argument, but I don't make it in quite as single-minded a way. I think that's why I said people were still giving sermons. The Irish were still lower order, in terms of the social hierarchies of the time. But there had been a real switch toward discussions of how do you provide home care, for example? How do you get the hospitals up to speed to deal with these, treating people? How does the city start thinking about monitoring sickness? And as I said, the Civil War had an important role because it made people think in terms of government responsibility. They would use the word hygienic issues, meaning everything from clean water to washing yourself to food that was not rotten, but also to providing skilled nursing and medical care. So it was a secularization, you might say, of their anxieties and their explanatory habits. But at the same time, and I don't want to do an injustice to what might call the standard intellectual history, they were the beginnings of what when you look back on it, you'd say, they were beginning to discover about the germ theory. They were beginning to have notions about how small molecular units, they weren't thinking about bacteria necessarily, but that could be transmitted from person to person. And that would explain why water was so dangerous. So they were modeling something that seems very modern to us. And there's a whole, genealogy of germ theory in which between, let's say, 1845 and 1866, you can gradually see the beginnings of modern notions about microbiology and infectious disease. That I don't want to, this is not a talk on that, but that history is going on too. It's not inconsistent with what I call the policy issues and with the increasing secularization. It's like the arrows are pointing in all the same direction.
Right. So basically, you're saying that you're able to trace by looking at how America reacts to and experiences and perceives the same bacillus, although it's not known as a bacillus then. In 1832, 1848, 1866, you're able to track how a move from pietism to materialism, from the way evangelical fervor is kind of replaced by a sort of positivism and a more critical and empirical temper, and the way really that sort of the ethics of public virtue now becomes dependent on public health in a way that it wasn't before.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it turns to some extent on notions about what public responsibility is, in terms of the role of government, bureaucracy. Should there be a Department of Public Health? Should there be a quarantine station? Should there be inspectors who went out and inspected tenements and made sure that the garbage was cleaned up?
Right. So in a way, having left medical school, I could imagine that you had friends who were telling you, Charles, what the hell are you doing? You could have become a doctor. Instead, you're studying a disease, now defunct disease that no one has died of in the West for many years, for generations, from the 19th century. And you studied it in a particular city, New York City, which was a big city, but still it's just one city. But in fact, you're trying to sort of tease the universe out from a grain of sand to say, we can use the reaction to disease and the felt experience of this disease in order to understand more broadly how America is changing.
Yeah, and that's why I use that metaphor sampling device. It's like you stick something in the water and come up with a sample to see how much, which bacteria are the dominant in that biome or whatever. But I think because of the fear, of the strangeness and fear that pandemics bring, that they are signal and not noise. They elicit very widespread and almost predictable debates from a lot of points of view. And we're living through it right now. You can see how this COVID-19 is articulated in our culture wars in this country, into our political mishigas, how and also how our hierarchies of race and caste are acted out in terms of it. And the very fact that we are halfway there in terms of understanding the disease makes it almost a better projective test. I mean, it would be nice to know if we had a accurate antibody test that was readily available, but we don't have a reliable test, and we don't know how the immune system works with this organism. Right. So there's a lot of projection going on, but it's projection that is articulated through our existing institutions, whether they're government or political parties or churches. Churches still are important, not the way they were in 1832. But what I'm saying is you can make the same argument about stress test sampling device for whatever this is, 2020 and 1832. And I think there's one, I was just thinking when I was walking the dog, that the one big change is, I would call it velocity. The speed of change and the speed at which not only the organism, the causative organism is spread, but the response to it.
Right.
It changes the quality, and it's intensified by changes in media and communication. So
let's talk about our moment and get closer to us. So after the Cholera Years, you studied various aspects of science and medicine, including psychiatry and law in the Gilded Age and the rise of the American hospital. And in particular, you looked at the ways in which social institutions and values shaped American scientific practice and thought. And you asked a pretty pointed question, which was, how can we reconcile the scientists' understanding of science as a quest for truth and knowledge with the historian's conviction that all of knowledge really bears the marks of the culture that gave birth to it? And one of my favorite examples is the brain. When you think of, how the brain was conceptualized in the 16th century, it was a hydraulic system in miniature encased in our skulls. Then, fast forward to the 17th century, it becomes a very complex mechanical clock. Then you go to the 19th century, suddenly it's a telegraph switchboard. Into the 20th century, it's a neural network. Some people speak of it today as a quantum computer. And each one of these entities is a different entity, a different brain of which you can really ask different questions and therefore receive different answers. So let's talk about our culture today. And I think that it seems, in particular from our homebound kind of lockdown situation, that our world is really almost tailor-made to be vulnerable in the following senses. Our economies depend on global supply chains. We engage in pervasive travel. We have face-to-face service industries. We have very high population densities in concentrated urban areas. In fact, we're probably more mobile and more social than humans have ever been in their history. And at the same time, the gap between rich people and poor people is widening. Our information environment is ubiquitous. It's very engaging, but it's also very unreliable. And our politics are extremely polarized. So in many ways, if you think of it as a trade-off, in the trade-off between efficiency on the one hand and resilience on the other hand, it seems like the architectures of our modern world, that we've put more of a premium on efficiency and disregarded the strength of local communities for the opportunities that come with an open world. So can I ask you to talk a little bit about this trade-off and how it's playing out in your view now in the response to COVID-19?
Well, you just made a political speech. That's okay. I think the bottom line in what you said gets back to something that I was implying, which is that the way the sampling device works is a configuration device. Configuration in the sense it makes you think about the relationships between different parts of society and different values, different practices, and that we sometimes take for granted. For example, in this country right now, the pandemic has foregrounded issues about inequality that were bubbling up Thomas Piketty, Raj Chetty. There's been a whole lot of academic discussion. But I think some of the outcomes of this disease make people think in a more systematic way about those kinds of trade-offs that you were implying. For example, shareholder value is not the sacred thing now that it was 10 years ago. And the market as ultimate rational and therefore moral maker of decisions is not what it had its moment. And I think that all these issues and subordinate issues like what about institutional populations? Who gets into prison and why? How do we treat old people? What are the role of the state and compared to individuals and voluntary organizations? They're all built into the question that you framed in a very general way. But I like to use the word performance of the pandemic. The performance meaning the narrative, what happens, how it's perceived, brings up and reorganizes priorities. And I think that our politics is not going to be the same whenever after is. And one of the variables, of course, is how you understand and control it. I mean, I'm enough of an old-fashioned, rational person to believe that some scientific ideas are closer to nature than others. We may not get there, but we know more about the brain now than we did in, 1650 or 1750. We know, but there's an awful lot we don't know, and what we do know tells us there's an awful lot we don't know. But I do believe that most scientists know that they're not hitting truth, that there's other truths beyond what they know, but that they're getting closer as a collective enterprise. And I think that describes how most scientists I know think. They don't think systematically, but I think that if you said you tortured them, if they didn't agree or disagree, they'd agree with that. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, so let's return to this idea of a sampling technique and to different trade-offs. So there's efficiency, there's resilience, there's also, it seems like, a trade-off between personal freedom and collective solidarity. And there's obviously a trade-off that we're experiencing right now between health and wealth. So just to sort of tease this out a little bit more, we make a concession for the benefit of using cars. And that concession equals roughly about 40,000 auto-related deaths annually in America alone. Now, if we knew that the price of getting our economy started again now would equal 40,000 lives, we don't know that now. But if we knew it for sure, then we could ask ourselves in our respective cultures a simple question: should we do it? And it's a cold cost-benefit analysis. And cost-benefit analysis is exactly this kind of telling measure of a society's moral compass, a kind of sampling technique that you're talking about. So my question to you is, to begin with, what do we know about cost-benefit calculations in America, say during the cholera epidemics or during the Spanish flu or the AIDS epidemic in the 80s? And what can we learn from the differences in the periods about how America has been changing? So first, a historical question.
Well, one historical place to start is that the world isn't like a philosophy class or a bioethics class where you frame a question the way you did. Things happen at the edges, they happen gradually, they sneak up on you. The automotive industry had a lot of origins, and it's complicated history, but no one ever said, how many lives is this going to cost us? It isn't, should I kill this one person to save these three people? you give as a test in bioethics 101. And I think history is more complicated than that. I think one of the byproducts of this debate is that you frame the question, and a lot of people are framing that question, which is in itself a datum. I think it's a thing. The fact where people say, oh my God, how do you make that decision? How do you say we're going to get herd immunity? Well, herd immunity means a lot of dead people. And I think that one of the byproducts of our moment in time, our imperfect technology, and our media is that a lot of ordinary people are not taking philosophy 101, but they're thinking about questions of moral value and even thinking about how do you think about them, it is something. And so something's happening. I can't tell you how different the world will be 10 years from now, but I feel certain it'll be different because there's been a kind of internalization, cultural internalization of thinking about what is the responsibility of society to individuals. In this country, we have a screwed up healthcare system, which everyone kind of now concedes. It's been performed for us, so to speak, and it's harder to ignore, just as the number of people killed in automobile accidents is background noise. So I don't really have a simple answer, but I think I wouldn't call it an admonition, but a lesson that at least I think I'd love them to come away with is the complex relationship we have between the sciences, the applied sciences, public policy, and social outcomes. That, that when you think about, well, how do we get a test for an antibody? How do we get a vaccine? How did we learn that there was such a thing as a virus and that it had this structure and its pathogenic qualities were based on that structure somehow? It's because we have basic research and we have translational research and we have all these institutions that we depend on. And I'd like to think that an awareness of that is, maybe this is my little prejudice because I'm interested in these questions, but I'd like to think that even our government officials will be more sophisticated, more aware of how dependent we all are on those relationships. Because you want an optimum relationship between basic science, translational science, the social institutions through which that reaches society generally. And I'm going to say can I say one more solipsistic thing? One of the things I worked on by accident when I was younger was the history of agricultural research, agricultural experiment stations. And there's something parallel between agriculture and medicine in that in the modern world, the linkage between the scientist, the applied scientist, the corporate world, and production, whether production is hybrid corn or production is dealing with a hip replacement. These relationships, to me, I never thought about it until recently, but they're very parallel. And I wish people could think that way and to say, how do we optimize those relationships and not turn them into antagonistic political issues? You can see my agenda, But I just wanted to get that in there because I think it is important. Yeah, I interrupted you, so I'm sorry.
No. So I'm trying to incorporate some questions from our audience. So there are a few historical questions, and then there are a few questions about the role of the historian. And so first, Elise Audrey Carpenter is curious about how family structures and different time periods intersect with the home caretaking of epidemics. And Faye Twersky is interested in you saying, can you say anything about the philanthropic response to previous epidemics? To what extent and how did wealthy people contribute to addressing the epidemic? So the home environment on the one hand and philanthropy on the other, in view of the history of epidemics.
Well, there's not a simple answer to either question, but let me start with, was it Ms. Carpenter's question? Mm-hmm. The families always, going back to classical antiquity, were assumed to do a lot of things that we now assume trained professionals do. Dealing with trauma, minor trauma, childbirth, childhood diseases, you name it. And in fact, one of the things that's always fascinated me, and I'm interested in the history of the book also, is the rich genre of books for the family on how to care for their members. Some of them having to do with women's role and, childbirth and maternal, care. Some that were herbal, which plants you can pick at which times of the year and use them to treat which diseases. So just the ubiquity of those kind of manuals and little handbooks and tells you that it was assumed that every family would have a certain competence. And one of the early reforms in public health was home nursing, visiting nurse services. So there always was an attempt to get medicine out into the family in urban settings. So it was something that was always there, and we now associate medical care with institutional settings, with the hospital, but remember the hospital up until 1880 or so was either for the very poor or for trauma or peculiar, or for there were mental hospitals that were atypical. And so it was assumed that medical care would be in the home. And a lot of people who wanted to provide health care for urban dwellers, for working class, lower middle class people, wanted to set up dispensaries, outpatient care, because they seen that no one would go into a hospital unless they were dying. So I think you have to realize that it's only in comparatively recent times that the institution, the hospital, the inpatient thing was the dominant form in which medicine was provided. I guess that's a more elaborate answer then, but there's a lot of research to be done on that whole history because it's so pervasive and elusive. Home care is like breathing oxygen. It's there, And what was the second question?
Philanthropy. How philanthropy functioned.
Well, you mean now or then, or?
And in comparison to now.
Well, you see it acting out. Philanthropy describes so many things that it's hard to pin it down. You have Bill Gates, says I'm going to give $100 million to stamp out polio or whatever. but then you have a lot of people who are disease-oriented. They've had someone die from cystic fibrosis, or they've had someone die from a rare cancer, and they want to put money into that research or into that care. And then you have, you might call it category. I want to help with maternal and child health, or I wanted to help the Hispanic community or farm workers, or so there's been a lot of in this country. It's a very complicated history, and you can't, for example, understand the development of institutions like hospitals and outpatient dispensaries without understanding philanthropy, because that's where the money came from, mostly, once it stopped being, or insofar as it wasn't a municipal function.
But let me expand the question a little bit. Philanthropy as a subset or as a species of social solidarity. Like when you look around you today and you see the manifestations of solidarity having to do with the response to COVID-19 at many levels, not just at the philanthropic level. Is there any kind of echo going back to the 19th century or the early 20th century, or do you see something?
Yes, I think it's, I think it's fashionable to look for the sunny side of life, and the sunny side of life here is the social investment of people in each other. Even when you're being locked down, so to speak, is a collective social good. People still find ways to communicate, to benefit each other, to provide funds for institutions, ranging from providing meals for people who are unemployed to doing rehab for people who've survived disease, let's say. So I think that there is an upside to the stress. On the other hand, other people would say that that's great. The more social bonding and resilience there is, and a sense of being part of another person, in a sense of responsibility of being a Christian. Is that your dog or my dog? Or
no, that was my daughter actually hiccuping.
Sorry. On the other hand, the nature of our society and the scale of our society is such that you need that social bonding needs to manifest itself through public policy. In other words, there's no way for government to look the other way and say, oh, isn't it wonderful morally and as a community for people to help each other, to get out at 7 and applaud health workers, to go to, well, you can't go to church because that's not, but but you can't escape, to me at least, as I said, the nature and scale of society is such that the government role is indispensable. And even if you look at the relationship, as I tried to emphasize, between the laboratory, the translational part, whether it's public or private sector, and the outcome for ordinary people, whether it's a pill they take or a thermometer that they use that then gets fed, the data gets then fed back. So without government, we couldn't have that complexity of society and that abundance of intellectual resources that turn into material resources.
So this ties into a question by Nadav Davidovich, who's interested to hear what should be the place of the historian of medicine and public health in the current crisis. Some would be very cautious, he writes, to be engaged in contemporary debates. Some might see themselves informing discussions by raising questions sensitivities or work with social scientists, the question is both epistemological and from an ethical normative point of view.
Well, it's a good question. And, I've been, well, I'm retired for some years now, but it's a question I've chewed on with students and colleagues for years. It's a very important question. It involves motivation. Why do you go into the field in the first place? It involves your choice of research subject, and it involves how you treat that subject. And I always think there's a kind of trade-off in which motivation is extraordinarily important. It also, whether you're interested in issues about race or issues about the distribution of medical, call them goods, availability of healthcare and access to healthcare, whether you're interested in cultural issues. So, for example, why did AIDS get treated the way it was? What did that tell you about notions about sexual behavior and identity at that moment in time? And how do you write about that without, quote, taking sides? I mean, how do you become a pure intellectual, floating above commitment and moral commitment? And a lot of our students go into history because they have those commitments. If they wanted to just go make money, they'd be, at a bank or a consulting company or hedge fund or something. Or if they were interested in art, they'd be artists. So our students are skewed a little bit toward people who are self-selected for having some kind of commitment. And a lot of times, I always welcome that, but I always try to get students to say, stand back a little bit, don't preach. Let's try to see how everybody in that situation looked at that situation and not just, blame people.
Right.
And because there's some of that, and that leads, I think, to narrower history and less nuanced history.
So it seems to me that there are a lot of prophets these days. A lot of people, telling us what the world will look like, what it should look like after Corona. And I'm personally very wary of these prophecies. I think that everyone has an agenda, and I think that the track record of divinations in any case isn't all that great. But what I do think that history and historians can provide is perspective, for what it's worth. And so based on your historical perspective, if that's possible, could you say something about what features of our social fabric and sort of the intellectual texture of our age do you think will be coming up for serious reconsideration? And what I mean by that are things like, how will our social sensitivities change living in the shadow of possible recurrent disruptions to our lives and of distancing? Will there be new others that we recognize and perhaps become afraid of or become nasty to? Will we be blaming people now that, categories of people? And how will religious belief be impacted? Let's start with those.
You want me to start with that? One of the things we start with is that we're in a very volatile moment. And one thing we know is that we don't know an endpoint either in terms of time or in terms of time as determined by, you might call it the intellectual and policy history that we're living through. I think it does make you humble to say this Chinese saying, you don't want to live in interesting times. We are definitely living in interesting times, but what you're implying is that it opens some things up to change. We know that when we come out the other end, whenever that might be, things will be a little different. And I alluded to some things that I sort of take for granted. For one thing, there's been a lot of discussion of inequality and of the peculiarities of the American healthcare system, which is an outlier in terms of Europe and most of the developed world in general. I think even the issue, the Vexit issue, which has been foregrounded for, I think, short-term political reasons, on the right, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And I think that there's going to be reconsideration of what gets called structural racism. There's people who are talking about government policy, banking policy, and how issues of where you're born and who you're born to need to be taken into consideration and not just assumed. That's an ongoing debate, but I think it's been intensified by this. And I think that another thing that is going to be in the American world, the whole structure of government is really under question. The issue of what gets called federalism. We have a government in which the states have certain responsibilities and rights. The municipalities often have asymmetrical ones, state to state. We have the executive role, which has gotten more and more powerful with the 20th century, with one war after another, with a whole set of reasons. And I think people are standing back from that and saying, this isn't right. We have to figure this out. I don't know what the outcome will be, and I'm not a law professor or a politician, but I know that there are tensions building up in the system that are going to have an outcome. And I don't know whether we're, Germany in 1932 or England in 1945 or something entirely different, more gradual, more, less melodramatic. But I think things will be different, and they'll certainly be different in healthcare. I'm pretty sure of that. I may not be around to see it, but.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is we're hearing a lot of people talking about how the world should become more just after this, and the post-capitalism, and that we'll all receive some kind of stipendia so that labor can be more a function of what who we want to be and what we want to do, and less due to necessities of having to put food on the table and all these sort of beautiful pictures of the world. But the more I look at what's happening around me, it seems to me that the disparities are growing, and that when there's a crisis, there's always a given amount of money in the world. It just changes hands, and it seems to me that this is just aggravating the gaps between the haves and the have-nots, the people who are tuned into a digital economy and those who are tuned into a physical economy. So it's sort of a beautiful time for utopians and for people who care deeply but want to move things in a particular direction, but not an indication that it will necessarily move in that direction in any sense.
Yeah, I think I didn't even bring up some of the issues that intensify. I didn't even mention climate change, which I think raises the stakes for all of the institutional and policy debates, and for the economic choices that are going to be made. And I think I did use the word velocity, I think, before, and because it's not just manufacturers that have a just-in-time delivery system, manufacturing system. I think society does. That things are faster, more interdigitated somehow. And we have supply chains that are not just to make cars, but also to do almost everything else, include populate our brains. So we've never lived in a world in which there's so much volatility at so many profound levels, from the climate to the American executive, and the internet and all the problematics built into your saying, well, the people who can live in the digital world are being moved further away from the people who are not in the digital world, et cetera. I mean, and you start thinking about one layer of volatility on top of the other. And as I said, the velocity, the speed at which things interact. And yeah, it's going to be different. And I'm going to just stop with that. I don't want to be on the record as saying anything that isn't evasive.
Right. So here's a question from David Green. He wants to know what you make of the apparent impulse among some conservative Americans to reject the very nature of the COVID-19 epidemic. And I've seen some people in rallies in the United States standing up with these signs saying COVID-19 equals a lie and social distancing equals communism and so forth. David wants to know, does the suspicion of the scientific effort seem like a genuine phenomenon or a manufactured one that is mainly political?
Option B. I think that it's been manufactured. Some of those people don't believe that, but I think the organizational part and all the survey data I've seen or quoted indicates that this is a really small minority, agitation that's been, fomented. So it's upsetting that there are people out there, with Confederate flags or, with automatic weapons, but it's a configuration, I use that word again, of attitudes and resentments, and they build up in certain people and they're consistent. I feel left out. I feel there are elites on the, East Coast. No one from Harvard's going to tell me what to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe even in Israel, there are people who, feel left out, resentful. Maybe they don't run around with automatic. Maybe they do have automatic weapons. But what I'm saying is that it's a manifestation of a larger set of resentments and social orientations. But I don't think it's a dominant, the kind of, there's no such thing as the epidemic. It's all a plot by, the left wing to take over our freedoms, et cetera, et cetera.
Here's a question from Etienne Lepicard, who says, can you say anything about the ethical shift people identify with an epidemic happening from a patient-centered one to a community-centered one? And I'll just tag on another question from Amir Teicher, who asks whether you're aware of an historical precedent to flatten the curve, a discussion like that, in which the main concern, at least in those countries where things were kept under control, was not that people would die from the disease itself, but that the health system would be overwhelmed.
I think the second question, we start with that one. I can't think of an exact parallel, to tell you the truth, because until recent times, the notion of inpatient intervention was not really a realistic, even in the 1918 flu, they were overwhelmed, but they didn't frame it quite that way, and they didn't have the high-tech options, the ventilators, the ICU apparatus that what's the word, ups the ante in terms of social investment. I'll have to think about that. I don't really, and one of the things that's interesting is selling the notion of flattening the curve. A lot of people have never heard that phrase, ordinary, man in the street, a woman in the street. And so there's a kind of educational aspect to this, and how you communicate. You communicate with graphs and curves and maybe even communicate how hypothetical those, thinking devices are. Or even like that herd immunity. I mean, epidemiologists know about it, but how many people in the United States, probably or Israel, had heard the phrase herd immunity? And so I think that there's been a kind of educational aspect to this. Not that people really understand, but there's been more of an effort to try to make some of these debates intelligible and to make the problematic aspects intelligible. There was another question, but I can't remember what it was.
I can't remember myself what it was, but in any case, so from an educational point of view, I've heard voices saying, that this was novel, therefore scary. Ultimately, when the dust settles, we will see that in most places, the mortality rate is not stupendous. It's every loss of life is terrible, but it's not stupendous. And that in fact, this is a dress rehearsal for something much, much more nasty that might come in the future.
Well, it might be. I mean, one of the depressing things about you might call it the micro history of emerging diseases from AIDS through SARS and Ebola, and, et cetera, swine flu, is that everybody's been beating their breasts and writing reports and talking about the danger of emerging diseases, and it seems not to have created the institutional structure, a responsive structure. In fact, as you know, our current administration cut back on investment in preparation and surveillance and international cooperation. So, this disease is very weird because it has characteristics we don't quite understand. The very diverse manifestations of it, whether they're immune system issue, cardiac, kidney, lung, which is people noticed first. And now there's a lot of discussion of clotting phenomenon. And so it's still a work in progress, so to speak, in terms of you might call it pathophysiology of the disease, or I don't know what the right word is.
Right, and also about susceptibility, the genetics.
Yeah, when I say the immune thing, it's all, that's the essence of it. And it hasn't been, it's easy enough to say, well, the case mortality rate is not that great. Look at Ebola, or which I think untreated Ebola is 50% or more. I've seen different figures depending on different, populations. So, here they're debating whether it's going to be, a half of 1% or 1% or a tenth of 1%. And, and so far our testing is so spotty and non-randomized that, we don't know yet. But that makes, our discussion sort of, it's a good moment to have this discussion because there's so many things up in the air that it makes you stand back and say, how do you configure them? Where are these balls going to come down when they come down?
Well, Charles, I think we need to end, but I want to thank you for a fascinating conversation. I do think that it is a right place to end with the words we don't know yet. We really imbibed the storm. I'm sure that the way we think about what we're going through right now, a year hence, will be very different from how we're experiencing it right now. And I want to thank you, for your perspective and also for your modesty. It's been a pleasure, and I hope we get to do it again in person before too long.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and let's hope things come out in a positive way when the balls drop.
Stay safe, my friend.
Same to you.
Bye-bye. And thanks to the audience, and thanks very much to Ohad, Ohad from Van Leer, who did all the transliteration as we were speaking. Much appreciated. Good night, everyone.